thanks for coming to our first ever Ask the Mirror event. This should be another fun and engaging evening. Hopefully most of you had the chance to join us for Zoom and Brews last month, which was really just so much fun. And we're hoping to get a piece of that again tonight on this first day of reopening in Connecticut. Slow reopening, but reopening nonetheless. I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions on that front. Before we get started, just a really quick plug. This is a CT Mirror membership event. As CT Mirror members, thanks for being here. I mean, this is for you guys. That's why we're doing this. We want to be as much of a resource to you as we possibly can. And, this Ask the Mirror Q&A event format is going to be something that we do on a quarterly basis going forward, along with Zoom and Brews, as well as a new event that we're excited to unveil for next month. I can tease that just a little bit now. That event we're calling a coffee conversation, and it will feature Jacqueline Rabe Thomas, our education reporter, and Education Commissioner Miguel Cardona. Very, very excited about that one. It's going to be a lot of fun and a very important conversation about the impact of this lost school year, so to speak, on K-12 kids. So we're excited to pull that together. We'll have more details on that soon. But in the meantime, I'm gonna hand this thing over to John. But John, I heard that you, as recently as maybe an hour and a half ago, were on the phone with the governor. Perhaps something for the podcast tomorrow? What'd he say?
Yeah. So Governor Lamont was nice enough to come on for our podcast. For those who don't know, we have a podcast. It's called Steady Habits, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts, as we say in the podcast business. But we've been doing a new series about reopening Connecticut, and the governor was good enough to come on and talk with us a little bit. He seems kind of bullish on this reopening, and I'll get a little bit more detail from Beth and Paz about what they've been hearing from the governor and other people at the Capitol about this. I also got a chance to ask him quite a bit about the dissolution of the Dalio partnership, this educational partnership, which kind of fell apart this week after a little bit of political infighting. And I suppose some lessons learned at the state capitol about what happens when you do things behind closed doors. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit later on as well. But again, I do want to say that the podcast is something that allows us to talk to a lot of interesting folks, people who people who maybe you don't know. The episode that we have out today, a few public health experts, one from Yale, one from Harvard, just giving us a sense as to whether or not Connecticut's ready to reopen. And I think that there's some split ideas from public health officials on that question. But I want to introduce our two Connecticut Mirror panelists tonight, the executive editor, Beth Hamilton, and the Capitol Bureau Chief, Mark Pazniokas. You know both of their work very, very well. We're going to get a chance to give you a chance to ask them questions about the news, about their work, how they do the work, all of those things. But we'll just start things off here by just asking a couple questions of both of you. And I don't know, Paz and Beth, I'll start with you. What brought you to the Mirror? Like, how did you get here through your career?
What a question. Not the straight line, really. So I was a journalist for 20 years and as a reporter, including a period of time when Mark and I worked together at the Hartford Courant as reporters together. And we both got caught up in a layoff when things really started to go south for the newspaper industry in 2009. And Mark was able to be part of that kitchen table conversation that you guys talk about, that you were both present for when the Mirror was formed. I, on the other hand, was about to give birth. So I didn't really have many job options at that point. And instead of going out and looking for work, 8 months pregnant, I had a baby, and then I raised 4 kids for a while, and I went back to school and got a master's degree, and I taught, and I wrote a bunch of poems, and I walked around outside and thought about things. And then finally my husband looked at me with a kind of a puzzled look on his face one day and said, "You are going back to a real job, right?" So I took a detour at that point. I thought, I'm just not sure that I want to be in journalism. I'm not sure there's a place for me right now. And so I got a job working in communications, and I gave it almost 3 years before I decided I was bored out of my mind and I needed to return to the newsroom, which was where I belonged. And the rest is kind of history.
And it's great history for us. I mean, I'm so glad you decided to do this. I actually didn't know you wrote poetry.
I do. Well, I used to. I don't have time anymore.
You don't have time anymore. And
Yeah.
did you, I mean, you did that pretty seriously for a while?
I did. I've been writing poetry since I was in my early 20s, and I got a master's of fine arts in poetry. And I had a series of poems actually that I wrote while I was in grad school that was set to music. It was a series of poems about the legend of Tristan and Isolde, and it was performed at the Mark Twain House by the Hartford Symphony. So it was a lot of fun. And that was
That's
like
super
my
cool.
last big thing in poetry. And I haven't written a stitch since. So
That's like, I mean, that's so much cooler than anything I've ever done. I'm so excited. I'm going to hear more about that offline. I'm not going to make this a
yeah.
poetry night with Beth Hamilton, but that's fascinating. So that's good. So Paz, you're going to have to top that. I mean, we did sit at a kitchen table with a bunch of other folks and helped to found the Mirror after you lost your job at the Hartford Courant. Do you have any hidden talents that we don't know about? Things that you had performed by the Hartford Symphony Orchestra?
None whatsoever.
Come on,
No,
you gotta have something.
I have been doing journalism for 40 years. I'm rather focused. It's all I wanted to do. And it's worked out wonderfully, even with some ups and downs. Even when I was caught up in a layoff with 131 other people, I had the softest landing ever. You know, I got a call the next day from an editor of the New York Times to ask me to write a weekly piece for their regional sections, which died a few months later. I'm hoping I didn't play any role in that. And then in the middle of that, you know, we were invited to have a conversation about something that led to the founding of the Connecticut Mirror 10 years ago. So it's really been quite the run. Now, my outside interests, they have to do with, I love Cape Cod. I love riding my bike there, despite the fact, as Beth knows and some other people know, they kind of cringe when they hear that, because I had a pretty good accident a few years ago, and
you did.
They had to screw my femur back together again, and it didn't work very well. So I am now partly bionic. Happily, I got that done before the pandemic, and it became very difficult to get anything other than life-threatening surgery. So no, I'm a Boston guy. I ended up in Connecticut. I never intended to stay. My first job was at the Journal-Enquirer in Manchester, which was a great place to work out of school. We had this incredible group of people, including the woman I married and have remained being married to. And it's just, you know, Connecticut became home. My wife's from New York. Like I said, I'm from Boston, and this turned into a very cool place to live and to raise a couple of kids who are now very interesting young women in their own. So that's my story.
So how are you both handling this whole quarantine thing? We're trying to work. We're working sometimes from home. We're working remotely. Paz, last time I caught up with you, you were working remotely, but you were on the Cape. Beth, you're juggling all sorts of things while you're trying to do this. Beth, I'll start with you. I mean, how are you muddling through this? How are you coping?
I think muddling is the right word. You know, I have a fifth grader, and in addition to three young I call them semi-adult daughters. And they're all three just kind of like grounded airplanes right now, as well, all four of them really, because the fifth grader's home all the time. And, you know, I see all these other moms on social media talking about, you know, the projects they're doing with their kids. And today my child built a robot, and like my poor kid is lucky. I'm like throwing frozen pizzas at him, going, snarling at him like, don't you know how to work the oven? Like it's really bad because my husband's also in a fairly high stress job right now. So, he sits down and just doesn't look up. I at least acknowledge we have a child. So, yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, it seems like it's a lot. It's a lot for a lot of people. How about you, Paz? I mean, how are you coping with all this stuff?
I enjoy getting out. I'll actually correct you. The last time we connected, I did a podcast with you, and I did that.
Oh, that's right.
I seated in my car behind a Shell station down the road from Mohegan Sun, which I had just spent an hour and a half touring with those guys who were trying to sell me and the rest of the world on why it will be safe to reopen. And that was a story that went up a week ago, and of course the tribes followed up today, informing the governor, ready or not, as far as he's concerned, they're going to open on June 1st. So it's that was an interesting development. But generally, it's there's so much you can do now remotely. The governor's press conferences, I think, generally have worked well. The governor does allow follow-up questions at these things. Governor Raimondo in Rhode Island got a lot of heat because when she was doing these, and I don't know if she changed, but the window would open and you could ask her one question and they would slam the window closed and you couldn't follow up. Going to sort of let it
hand if you want to come on screen and actually ask a question of Beth and Mark. So Kyle can explain some of that in a bit. We're going to get to some of your questions in just a moment. I'm wondering, Beth, maybe I can ask you this first, how you balance in a crisis like this relationship with the governor or the relationship with state government. You're trying to inform people. They're giving out these daily briefings or regular briefings because people need to know information. But you still have to ask tough questions and you have to probe and try to find information. They're not going to be forthcoming with everything, but in some ways they're giving you way more information than they would during a normal time when things are normal. How do you balance this need to probe, to ask questions, to do things that are hard hitting, and also to listen to the government as they try to inform people from their perspective about things they need to know?
Well, fortunately, I don't have to do that hard work. My poor reporters do. But I do think that it's a good question. I think one of the things that's been difficult for us is realizing that, first of all, most of the reporters on my staff have been dealing with these folks for a long time. And so, there's a relationship. Relationships have already been established. Trust has already been established. And we're cognizant of the fact that these are human beings with all of the same problems and challenges that we have. And they are in charge of responding and keeping the public safe. So I think that there's been a lot of sensitivity on the part of the journalists on my staff about that issue, and recognizing that, it's not normal times and we can't expect them to respond the way we might otherwise expect them to respond. But I think I'm going to let Paz take the rest of that answer because he can speak to that better than I can.
Of course, I was just glancing at a text message from one of the tribes and I was trying to read that while listening. So I think I got the question. It's the loss of face-to-face contact, casual contact, has been difficult. One of the things that's wonderful about working at the state capitol in the legislative office building is it's the serendipitous part of it that you run into folks all the time. You may be working on a story, you have been unable to connect, and you see them. Or you're standing in line getting coffee and you're in a conversation and you realize there's something going on, or you can physically see things in that building because of the way they're set up. And if I've been around long enough, if I see 4 lobbyists in a corner, I quite often can figure out, oh, something's afoot, and based on who's there, I know who I need to go talk to and find out. And I do miss that greatly. In fact, one of my kids, when she was young, somebody asked her what her father did, and her answer was, he walks around the legislative office building drinking coffee all day, which is kind of what I do.
That's exactly what you do.
Yeah.
It's a big part of the job.
It is. I once had an editor, not Beth, who suggested I work out of the Hartford Courant newsroom more. And I said, I've never once gotten a story idea getting coffee in the cafeteria at the Courant, but it happens every day at the LOB. I think everybody's been sensitive as to the pressures on the people we're covering. In normal times, you look at a governor's press office and you say, hey, they got it easy. It's not bad. It's good money. Today, you look and you go, oh my God, they're really understaffed, particularly if you happen to see Governor Cuomo and the crowd he brought up. I mean, he's got a production company that kind of travels with him, and Lamont's pretty much has two guys you rely on, and they're working it. And Max Reese is somewhat of a public figure. He was on TV and he's on Facebook a lot. A lot of people know he's got twin toddlers, and I have had conversations with Max where part of the backdrop is him trying to instruct his son on why it's a good idea to use a toilet. That literally happened yesterday. And I'm sure actually, I know he would be fine me sharing it, because if you go onto his Facebook page, you'll see video of him bribing his son with tractors. I don't know how long this is sustainable, but I digress.
Everybody's dealing with it, right? Everyone's throwing pizza at the kids. They're potty training. They're doing everything. We've got a lot of people. Want to ask questions. And hey, Kyle, I'm going to ask you here. I want to make sure Martha has a good question, and she wanted to maybe ask it in person. How do we do that?
Hey everybody, I'm back for just a second here. I posted in the chat how this is gonna work tonight. We are gonna take written and verbal questions tonight. I can see the written ones coming in already. They look fantastic. I'm excited to hear the answers to these as much as you are. But if you'd like to ask your question yourself, you can use the raise hand button, which is near the bottom of your screen, and you'll all get in line, so to speak, and we'll try to alternate back and forth between written questions and the verbal ones. So I'm going to start with Martha, just because she had her question in first. If that's all right with you, John, I'll go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
Switch it over, but let's have some fun.
Oh, good. So Martha's going to come on with us. We'll see if this works. Martha, are you there? During the Zoom and Brews, this sort of thing happened too, and it's very much like doing a call-in radio show, which I did for a very long time, which you're like, hi Martha, Martha's calling from Fairfield. Martha, you're on the radio. Martha?
Fairfield?
Martha,
no way. I'm from New London. I am not from Fairfield.
Good. See, you caught me, Martha. You caught me. How you doing?
It's been a hard day, but I'm okay.
Yeah. So what's your question for Paz and for Beth?
Hi, you guys are awesome. So I'm a nurse, and we actually lost, I'm also part of AFT, the local here. We lost a PCA last night. She worked on the COVID floor, and she died of COVID. And
I'm so sorry.
Beth here at L&M and the VNA. And we've just been, it's almost becoming the new normal now, the awful way we use PPE. And I'm going to give myself a plug. If you listen to the Reveal podcast called Unprotected, I am in that podcast. It's an excellent podcast.
They do good work.
And so we don't understand the fact that we don't do contact tracing in the hospitals, but we're used to that now. So my question is, in the testing, why aren't they testing all of the healthcare workers in nursing homes and assisted livings and hospitals and VNAs? We need to be tested. I can tell you that our staff, I'm just a nurse, I'm not management, that we have infected patients, but it will never come out because you can never prove anything, just like we'll never get work
Hmm.
because we can't prove anything. But why aren't we doing testing and this contact tracing using volunteers? If we have never learned anything about this pandemic, should tell us how important public health is, and that our economic health is completely tied with our public health. And we don't need volunteers to do contact tracing. We need trained people that are accountable and that are regulated. So you always have more answers than anybody else. So I'm asking you about testing in
Yeah,
healthcare workers and contact tracers.
great. Martha, thanks for the question. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that. So a couple things. I mean, one, I want to talk about a reporting challenge because, one of the struggles of reporting during this pandemic is we are reliant on the governor's briefings and briefings by his staff. And we have limited access to people like Martha. In the best of times, you don't just walk into a hospital and wander around, but these ain't the best of times. And of course, that's become very difficult. And that's been a challenge from the start of this, is trying to corroborate what we're hearing at the Capitol. And I don't mean to suggest that they are deliberately misleading people, but the word that bubbles up to the top quite often is different from what's happening on the ground. So anyway, I just wanted to say that. On testing, Josh DeBall, who's the governor's chief operating officer, and he's kind of the interagency coordinator, he says that they're at the point now where that kind of testing that Martha asked about is going to happen. It's still a little ad hoc as far as I can tell. There is no comprehensive system in place. This has moved very quickly. I've said this to Beth when they were aiming for the May 20th opening. It was as though they were still building a runway for a plane that was coming in. They were building out the testing capacity. They were building out the contact tracing. So all I can say to Martha is they say that kind of testing is coming. We get some feedback that it is more plentiful. They had a goal for May 20 of doing 42,000 tests a week. They did 50,000 this week, and their goal before they get to the next phase in June of reopenings is to be at 100,000 tests a week. On the contact tracing, Connecticut's nowhere near the standard that is suggested by the National Association of Health Directors. Their recommendation is for during a pandemic that a state the size of Connecticut should have close to 1,000 people doing contact tracing. Connecticut currently has 300, 270 at the local health districts and health departments, and 30 at the State Department of Public Health. They are recruiting 400 or 500 volunteers. Now, these are not just walk-ins, people coming off the street. They are dealing with schools of public health. They're dealing with schools of medicine. These are going to be, the state says, fairly rigorous programs. But as of today, with the reopening, they don't have that in place. Another word about contact tracing is the state pretty much gave up on it once the caseload really blossomed. Matthew Carter, the state epidemiologist, told us early on that this thing would quickly get to the point where containment no longer was possible, and then it would be mitigation, trying to slow the spread. And anybody who cares enough to be on a call like this, they know about flattening the curve and trying to keep the hospitals from being overwhelmed. And in fact, the state was successful in doing so. So as they reopen, the idea is to be more aggressive in doing contact tracing to try to prevent these small outbreaks that they may detect from becoming bigger. So that's the status right now. And again, ultimately, whether all that is in place, we'll see. I did a piece about the contact tracing and pointing out that the state was relying on a system that didn't fully exist, and that there was some discomfort by some of the health directors that because of the nature of this novel coronavirus, there's no reliable therapeutic treatments, although we're now getting to the point with plasma treatments and whatnot that is changing. But one of the concerns that I was getting from health directors is that one of the tools that they had was the shutdown and limiting people's exposure. So there was a lot of nervousness about what they're doing now. And as I speak, it occurs to me I should circle back to some of those folks I interviewed a month ago and to see what their thoughts are today.
I want to ask a question coming in from William Malone, who asks, why is the governor spending $2 million of our money to hire a Boston consulting firm to manage the reactivating of the state's economy? Beth, do you want to flesh that out a little bit? What have you heard in terms of the rationale for hiring this outside consulting firm, given that we already had this kind of volunteer force of experts, this committee to reopen Connecticut that has just recently been dissolved?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, other states, neighboring states, are also using the same consulting firm. Am I right about that, Mark?
Absolutely. The regional group has also hired this consulting group. So there's some coordination effort, but yeah. It's,
I think that the governor kind of intent on being in sync with his neighboring governors, and also he plans to disband this kind of kitchen cabinet that he's put together to advise him this week.
That's correct. They're doing that. There is a sense that they do need this added expertise. Whether that's ultimately true, I don't know. But to the questioner, Mr. Malone, I mean, I know $2 million is a lot of money. Lamont is relying on some people who are from the world of business, and in a world where if they have a problem, a very complicated problem, such as dealing with a pandemic, reopening, trying to re-engineer an economy, this is what they do. BCG, the company they hired, is not as well known as somebody like McKinsey, but they're a big firm. You read the contract, they're getting, they're supposedly getting the government rate and all that, but they say it's money well spent. It'll be at least 75%, I think, will be federally reimbursed. It is still taxpayer money, to be sure. But the feds are allowing this kind of thing to help these states as they try to do a lot very quickly.
There's no governmental function that can take the place of this. There's nothing set up at any level of state government in the executive branch that takes the place of what an outside consulting firm could do, or any of that expertise?
As part of the emergency, the state uses this framework that the feds had outlined many years ago, and you organize by broad functions. And Connecticut has used that. And I'll confess, I'm not in a position to say that this is crazy or this is brilliant or that this is justified. There are certain limits in the best of times as to our ability to look under the hood. It's a little bit easier when we're at the Capitol and the Legislative Office building every day, and there's full staffs and you can FOI things. But bottom line is, I don't know. I don't know if this is absolutely necessary. I can say that there are people I deal with regularly who are acting, I believe are acting in good faith, who believe this is, very, very much necessary. So bottom line is, I don't know, but that's direction.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just add that, like so many other elements of the pandemic response, it's going to be a while before we can really accurately assess how successful the government has been in responding to this, and where the fault lines and mistakes were made along the way, and what should have been done differently. Because when you're in the middle of a hurricane, and it's very hard to see clearly around you. And I don't know that they had a very clear playbook, because this kind of came out of nowhere, right? So they're responding in real time to events that they had no real preparation to respond to. I mean, there were plans, but there weren't, there were emergency response plans, of course, but that's not the same.
And this is a unique disaster in that not only in that it affects the entire state, which is unusual for, if you have a hurricane or a blizzard, but it affects every state. And to have the economy turn on its head so quickly, and with all that entails, the ripple effect.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I don't say that to defend what they did, but it clearly is this, this unprecedented, it's such a weak word, unprecedented, but it is. There's no playbook on this. There's going to be a lot to sift through as far as how the state handled it. The governor got basically, in the beginning, I think there was a lot of support, got a lot of good marks for being fairly open, available every day. As it's gone on, his closing orders have become more controversial. The basis for them, people pushing back. He made on Monday what I think a lot of people would think would be something of a political gaffe. He reversed himself with short notice. The barbers and hairstylists were supposed to be able to open Wednesday, and he said on Monday you can't. That doesn't reflect well on that kind of reversal with 2 days warning to folks who were geared up, who had some of them who were protesting today said, look, we've been preparing for this. It was reasonable to close us for when he did, but we were given a date to open. We've prepared, and the people who are uncomfortable should not open, and the clientele who is uncomfortable should also stay on. So, I mean, but overall, I think he's tried very hard to give the rationale for what they're doing. And I remember very clearly, I was the reporter who sort of pressed him first on metrics. What are your metrics? At the early days, he said, that's a good question. We don't know. He's been pretty good about saying, we don't know. They've put together what they put out again today. They reiterated the metrics that are there, that they're hitting their mark so far. There is concern about, will there be a resurgence of the COVID virus? But go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and Beth, one of the things that the governor told me when I talked to him just a little bit ago was, I asked him about this whole state solution. I mean, he's looking to do something that other states haven't done, which is try to have Connecticut act as a whole as opposed to in parts. My home state of Pennsylvania is opening up in red and blue or red and yellow districts, depending on how well they were doing on bending back this curve. For the first time in a while, when he talked to me today, he expressed some concern about what comes out of Fairfield County, and what happens in the area that's the biggest hotspot near New York over the course of the next couple of weeks. Have you or your reporters been hearing more about whether or not this whole state solution is what we're gonna go with over the course of the next several months?
I talked to a lot of
Beth was going to jump in. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say that I don't know that we've been hearing that that it's not going to work, but there's certainly been some pushback and concern from different areas of the state, largely the areas that haven't had hugely high infection rates. So I think it was Cromwell, Mark, where the town council voted to basically defy the governor's orders and reopen. And I'm a little unclear as to whether or not they're actually going to do that. But I do think that there are different reactions to this. And if you're in the quiet corner of the state, you may think, well, why did our schools, we heard a little grumbling about that. Why did our schools have to stay closed? We don't even have one case. Now they probably do. But I think the governor's approach overall has been seen as sensible, at least if you judge from his, the polling approval ratings of his handling of the crisis. Anyway, Mark, go ahead. You were going to say something.
He's been very reluctant to split the state up into regions just because of the size of the state. I think you could probably have a more reasoned conversation about should schools in Eastern Connecticut perhaps be allowed to reopen. The caseload is lower, although it keeps, the numbers keep adding. It's in the national press. I think I kind of cringe a little bit because you see some of the people who are urging for restrictions to be eased. A lot of times they're portrayed as just being idiots, and as opposed to many of them are making reasoned arguments about how to reopen when. And reasonable people, I think, could disagree over something like, okay, should a school system in Eastern Connecticut be allowed to reopen a little bit earlier? Yeah, I think it's a reasonable debate to have. What's the downside to children of keeping places closed? You don't have children who are at risk being in the view of mandatory reporters, and that's a concerning thing. And I asked that question to Zeke Emanuel, one of the doctors who's on the advisory group, the other day, and he said that's something they struggle with. Emanuel is one of the people who argued in favor of opening summer camps, and it became apparent today that he has succeeded in convincing the governor of that. But there are pros and cons to that, right? Kids lose a lot when they're not socializing, but as a reporter, I think most of us have had a fair amount of sympathy for the policymakers who are trying to, again, they keep talking about balancing the obvious public health concerns against collateral damage, to the economy and to human beings.
I want to get to a question. I think we've got another live question here. We're going to try out this fancy Zoom thing with Richard Davies. Richard, I see his name there. Now let's see if we can get his picture up.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, Richard, how you doing?
I'm good. Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Hi.
What's your question?
Good evening. Yeah, we've heard a great deal, quite rightly, about the enormous cost to public health that presented by the virus, but it has also done tremendous damage to the economy as well. I noticed today driving on I-95 that the traffic is really picked up, and that more people are moving around than they were before. I wondered in your reporting whether you've seen a significant difference in the views of legislators, state legislators, from more rural and suburban areas than from cities, or from areas which haven't had a very large penetration of the virus compared to places like New Haven and Hartford, where the health damage has been much worse.
Absolutely. There was, at least publicly, it was nearly unanimous, their support for the governor. And then in April, when he extended the closure orders to May 20th, that shocked people, and there was the first pushback. But on a regional basis, absolutely. There are people in Eastern Connecticut, in the legislature, as well as in the chamber out there, who have urged the governor to reopen that part of the state quicker. They support the tribes being able to reopen the 2 casinos June 1st. The unemployment in Eastern Connecticut is, it spiked really quickly. That part of the state does rely on the hospitality industry more than the rest of Connecticut. So once you move past Electric Boat and the smaller shops that feed into that supply chain, they're hurting, and there is that pushback. The governor, again, he's very uncomfortable with the idea of drawing lines within Connecticut, particularly for anything that's open to the public. The idea of having a town, where you can go to a bar and have indoor dining, but the next town over you can't. He's very, very leery of that, and he's also, concerned about. Yeah, he's just generally concerned about resurgence. But there's no question that there's pressure and there's objections about treating the state is one unit. I talked to a restaurant owner. He's got 3 restaurants in Eastern Connecticut. And, he was apologetic in talking about it. I mean, that's the thing. Other thing that strikes me is most of the people I talk to, they're very sympathetic to what the governor is struggling with, trying to protect public health. But, they're getting antsy, and they're looking at other states. And so far, at least the last time I looked, Georgia's reopening. There's a lot of criticism, but so far, so good. Parts of Texas, again, so far, so good. Now, will that hold up? That's a good question. But yes, we are now seeing dissent and pressure to say maybe we need to treat different parts of the state differently.
I also think it's worth noting that there were no lawmakers on the governor's reopen committee. And so, if he had wanted their perspectives on how to reopen in different parts of the state, he didn't get it officially through that process. And I think there's some bad feelings about that. I could be wrong.
There are definitely bad feelings about that. But there were regular conference calls with the governor's office and the leadership, which is a little bit different than having them in the loop on the reopening, to be sure.
Right.
But it's a mixed bag. I mean, if you do participate in that, you better be prepared to own it. And I'm not sure all the legislators were.
I think that we'll probably get some more questions about the way the Mirror has been covering the COVID-19 crisis, but I wanted to make sure I got this in. My friend Doug Stone wants to ask about the story behind the failure of the Dalio committee. Beth, you and I were on the phone yesterday. I was supposed to talk with you and Paz for the podcast, and you said, not going to happen. Actually, there's some news happening. I thought, oh, well, there must be news happening around the state's response, or, another sector is not going to open or something like that. And you told me that this Dalio partnership, and I'm sure that most of the people on the call know what we're talking about here, this plan that the Dalio family had to put $100 million into state education reform, have the state kick in $100 million and raise some more money. It all basically fell apart. I'm wondering, Beth, if you can, help Doug understand a little bit better what we know about what happened there.
Well, we know a few things. We know that the Dalios were always uncomfortable with the idea of being subjected to kind of the state's, open government laws, FOI laws, and they requested at the very beginning of this process, when they made the offer and proposed their $100 million, that the whole partnership be exempted from FOI law. Now, I think ultimately what happened is that the outcry over that issue didn't go away. And not only did it not go away, but it very recently got worse, because Barbara Dalio and other people in her philanthropy organization made a move to oust the recently hired executive director of the Partnership for Connecticut. And that information got leaked to the press. And I think it was at that point that Barbara Dalio and others, probably with her philanthropy association, said, okay, that's it, we're out. We don't have to put up with this. State, you can take your money and go home, and we'll just keep doing what we were doing because we don't want to deal with this anymore. There's other elements of this about the governor's belief that this was going to work, why he thought that was going to work. Has he met lawmakers? It's he didn't seem to have a very great understanding of how difficult it was going to be for the Fourth Estate and lawmakers and other people who are interested in open government to accept this idea of a public-private partnership that's spending taxpayer money and isn't subject to FOI. So,
but what's so interesting, Beth, is as I was just talking with him, I asked him again about this, and he so firmly believes that this is a model that will work going forward, that that there are other people who he knows in his circle. And again, he's made a lot of money. He had a lot of money and he's made a lot of money. He knows people who are rich and might want to give the state some money, but he believes that they're not going to want to do business the way the state usually does business. And they're all going to come with strings attached like the Dalios did. And I guess I'm just wondering if we're going to see this again, or if the backlash over this actually starts to change the administration's mind about doing business like this.
I don't know. Paz is closer to him, obviously, than I am. I don't know if he's going to back off of that belief. I don't think it's going to work particularly well. I think he's going to run into the same questions and objections, no matter how many times he tries to do it. I think the only way he's going to get people to buy into this is if he agrees to have public money be subject to public scrutiny. Anyway, Mark, you want to add something to that?
There's a fine line sometimes between having a fresh and being absolutely naive about the way politics works. And, you know, the governor has brought some very bright, dynamic people in from the business world. He's tried to have, you know, a fresh approach to how you do business. Before the pandemic, they were trying to really modernize a lot of things in state government in ways that aren't very sexy or interesting. But, you know, this was to me, this was a clash of cultures of well-to-do philanthropy versus the rough and tumble world of politics. And the governor thought they could put it together. It was awkward from the start over the issue of the transparency issues. And he hasn't given up on the idea of bringing in people from the outside. But he, I would say he was clearly wounded the other day. He could have announced the dissolution of this through a press release or just sort of mentioned it as the briefing, but he felt strongly he wanted to do something in person on the steps of the Capitol. And he clearly was stung. And what became clear is he felt a little embarrassed that that this philanthropy was not appreciated. He's had the same view at times about the advisory group. You know, there's been pushback on the advisory group about who's in it and who's not, and that's all part and policy. You know, it's part and parcel of being in public life. You know, but I think he was almost embarrassed that a lot of people he recruited to volunteer hundreds of hours in some cases, you know, Albert Coe, who's the Yale epidemiologist who co-chaired it, you know, he put a lot of work into this, and I think most people would be appreciative of it, and they are. But again, the governor, he seemed not to understand why there was pushback, why some legislators are complaining that there was no representative of the General Assembly and that kind of thing.
And I think it's just, and we'll move on to another thing, but Beth, I think it's an important point because sometimes when we have this conversation, you know, when I was on the Wheelhouse for years, we would talk about transparency issues, and often we would amongst ourselves think, does the rest of the world care about the press's need for freedom of information? But this is one of those instances in which the lack of information, when that lack of information is extended to people in the legislature, all of a sudden it comes back and bites you in the butt. And it makes you think quite a bit about whether or not it's not just the press that wants it, it's whether it's lawmakers, people in general. I mean, there's a reason why we care about freedom of information, right?
Right. There's a really good reason. I mean, the issue of government accountability, I don't think the general public understands until something goes wrong. And then they're like, oh, right. And so getting them to understand why it would be important that, you know, there be full disclosure and public scrutiny on how this, you know, Partnership for Connecticut was spending $100 million of taxpayers' money in public schools. Like, how are those decisions being made? You know, who is going to get this money and why? What is the rationale? And if those conversations are taking place behind closed doors, there's a very real chance that something could go wrong.
Mm. So I'm going to ask Kyle for a ruling here, because I think we got started a little late. Maybe we can go a little bit over 8 o'clock. Kyle can come in and let me know, because we got a lot of questions to go. Kyle, you're the master of ceremonies? I don't do anything without asking you first. Can we go a couple minutes past 8 o'clock?
I think it's in line at this point for us to make sure that we get as many of these questions answered as possible. And so, folks, thank you for the questions. This has been great. Really.
Yes. Yeah, we got a lot of good questions here. So what we're going to do is a little lightning round to get to some things. Paz, quick answers here. Ann Sawyer asks, A, do you know if there will be a special session? And how will Connecticut ensure November election is safe and secure and accessible?
Lightning round, huh? Yes to the special session. They will definitely be coming in. The Safety in November, the governor, he signed an executive order today, which is limited. It's about loosening up a little bit on how you can use an absentee ballot. But there is a plan. The Secretary of State's office did get a federal grant that they're now working with the cities and towns. As many people know, that elections actually are run by the cities and towns. The Secretary of State's office has limited authority in that area. But it's an open question. Connecticut has very restrictive rules on the use of absentee ballots. And some of those rules are in our state constitution. So there's a limit as to how you can loosen them. But the governor signed an executive order tonight, which, because I'm doing this, I haven't had a chance to read yet. I think I know generally what it does. But yeah, anyway, those are 2 quick answers to that. There will be a special session at some point. They're going to have some budget issues, and they will possibly be looking at things they need to do to make the election safer. And the other question is, one of the big unknowns is the governor's emergency powers expire on September 9th. And the question is, what happens after that? Does the legislature want to take control of this? Will there be another emergency? But those are some of the things that they got to figure out.
This is a bigger picture editorial question. I'll throw to you, Beth. Marty Ryan wants to know, what are your standards regarding accuracy and reporting and separating facts from opinion? Oh, that's a that's a big question for a lightning round, but
yeah, well, I mean, obviously we try to have the highest standards for those things. I'm not exactly sure how to answer the question other than to say that's at the core of our mission and what we do every day. And I think we're very careful as a news organization, and when we do get something wrong, we move to quickly correct it and explain why and how we got it wrong. I may be missing some of the underlying connotation of that question.
Well, I will just say, I mean, what I read into that is a sense that a lot of people, maybe more than ever in my life, seem to have opinions, and they're very willing to give them to the press, including opinions about things that in which facts would be more useful. And you're bombarded, especially when covering something like this from so many angles, with a whole bunch of things that could be facts, that could be people's opinions. And I think a lot of people in the public who don't do this work want to know, how do you figure that out? Like, how do you figure out what is an actual piece of information that you can report, or just somebody saying something?
Well, there's obviously, maybe not so obviously, actually, there's some standards, right? So, if you want medical advice, you don't go up to, some guy in the street you've never met and ask him what he thinks if the mole on your cheek is cancerous. You go to a doctor. So journalists are just like everybody else. We seek out information from the people that we understand to be experts in that information. So if we want to know whether or not the governor is going to lock down the state, we call the governor's office. We don't just say, report that there's a rumor going around. So for example, for 3 or 4 days before the governor made a decision to close schools, we were hearing the governor's going to close schools. The governor's going to, the rumor was going around everywhere. We didn't report that. We waited until the governor closed the schools, because I think that especially in times of crisis, which this is, it's very important to verify information before you report it. And it's been especially confusing because even the experts have changed course. At first we were told, for example, you don't need to wear a mask. Don't go out and buy a mask. People who are hoarding masks are doing it wrong. Don't do that. And then, lo and behold, 2 months later, everybody should be wearing masks. So, we're doing the best we can, just like everybody else. At times I felt like we've had whiplash from the different.
And that's so interesting, though, Paz. What Beth was just saying, though, is because covering this pandemic means that we have to listen to so many medical professionals. One of the things that happens with medical professionals, right, is they get new information and they change their story. Now, reporters love to say, "Gotcha, you said this a week ago, and now you're saying this," and doctors are like, "Yeah, because we got new data," and so that can be a little bit different.
And the medical establishment's understanding of COVID-19 has changed and broadened and deepened, and yet some of that understanding has raised even more questions. So I think that this continues to be an evolving story. For example, if you look at the issue of the children who are getting sick with this specific kind of side illness that's related to COVID but isn't COVID. Like, we had no understanding of that at the beginning. Think about what we were told in the beginning of this. This doesn't really impact kids. Well, actually it does. So, and the best we can do is report the information when we have it and try to explain why it has changed.
Sorry, Mark, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, but I was going to say, when he asked about opinion, as somebody who covers politics, I'm always sort of sensitive to that, because you have to be analytical, I think, if you're offering value to your readers. And that means, again, there's a fine line, opinion, analysis. You should show the facts that you're basing your analysis on. But writing about campaigns is a little bit like doing theater reviews, because there is an element of theater in it. And you are trying to explain, when they say this is who they're talking to. You're trying to decode and translate what campaigns mean. And that means writing with a voice. And that means, again, offering your analysis which should be based on your reporting and experience. And if you're afraid to do that, you're robbing your readers. Although we did get, we have a tip line during COVID, and some of them are just comments. And one of them was a guy who said, "Why are you so afraid to offer opinions?" It's like, well, no, I think we write with authority, but it's just generally opining about, whether or not somebody said something that you might think is dumb or brilliant, that doesn't really serve any purpose.
I've heard a lot of people ask this of reporters and editors recently, and I think it's valuable at this time. There was another Beth rally, so-called, at the Capitol today. People who want to reopen the state quicker. How do you think about the sometimes small numbers of people who will make a lot of noise versus a large group of people, maybe who think something different, who might make not very much noise at all? I mean, both things are important to report. Sometimes people think that the small squeaky wheel gets a little bit too much attention. I mean, how do you view that piece of the story?
Well, I think it was something Mark said earlier, which is that it's been difficult during the last few months to do our jobs the way we would normally do them, which, because we can't, we couldn't really just go out and visit people, right? So we were doing everything remotely, doing our jobs remotely, trying to reach people remotely, and when people decide to go protest in public, that makes it a lot easier to find them and talk to them. But that said, I do think that my reporters have made a real effort to try to reach the people who are not out protesting, who are behind closed doors, either because they're sick or because they're self-quarantining or they're just living their lives, but they all have stories to tell. So
And polling helps at times. It's sort of a gut check of, okay, as I'm old enough to recall the silent majority of the Nixon years, and it's always good to see some data on what is public opinion on this. And the Quinnipiac had a poll out today, which said generally, the majority of people want the reopening to be slow and steady. But also when it came to, is it safe to get a haircut? It was pretty much 50-50, which we've sort of seen. We had hairstylists protesting that it was too soon. And now we had, barbers and hairstylists protesting that, why did you delay again? So that seemed to actually reflect public opinion. But it's always a scary thing. If what does a protest represent? What is behind it? When these have been tough, some of them are rolling rallies. They're just in their cars and you can't talk to them. But when I covered protest, there were certain questions I always ask is, are you registered to vote? When was the last time you voted? You try to get a sense of, who are these people? Do they reflect power at the polls? Or are they people who just sort of enjoy the moment of being outside the Capitol on a nice day and protesting? And, those are the sort of the tricks of the trade you learn as a reporter. You try to measure that. When gun control was a big issue, after Sandy Hook, I went to the state's biggest gun owner group to their meeting. And, I ran through my regular questions about, where do you live? Are you enrolled? Are you in a party? And to the organizers, what can you tell me about what legislative districts they're in? And, and you could see this was a group that was kind of new and feeling its way, but they hadn't quite figured out how to translate their passion about Second Amendment into stuff that probably was going to show up at the polls, as far as, okay, you can tell somebody in this Senate district who your people are, so there's that kind of stuff you do to try to figure out, is what you're seeing, does it really reflect something deeper? It's an imperfect
Sure.
art, I will quickly add. And sometimes you see it the first time, you go, oh, this is just a bunch of noisy people. And then it grows,
We just have time for a couple more questions, and there's two actually from an anonymous attendee and also from Kathy Flaherty, both having to do, one having to do with schools actually. So really quickly, somebody who's very concerned about the opening of schools. What more? I think we talked about it briefly. What have we heard from the administration about what's going to happen in the fall?
I don't think the administration has made any pronouncements about what's going to happen in the fall, unless I'm wrong, right, Mark?
No, they've not. We've heard more from colleges because they're doing this stuff on their own. But as far as the public school systems, they have not really said anything. The assumption seems to be is, barring a resurgence, and that's the X factor. What happens in the fall? What happens over the course of the summer as we reopen?
Yeah.
And what will we know? Will we know in August that something we don't know now about the vulnerability of children, or which children, under which circumstances? So, yeah.
Because I was going to say this, in this person has some experience with special needs children, and I think that's a big piece of it. There's a whole bunch of folks who need the routine that school provides, but also would be almost impossible to bring back to school in the settings that we've had them in before.
Well, and that, when I was talking about balancing how you can have a reasonable conversation about, what is best for the children, it depends which children you're talking about. And yes, the special needs children, clearly this does not, many of them rely on structure. You can't sit them in front of a computer. A lot of them in the public schools get one-on-one time, and that's all gone. And that, your heart just goes out to parents with a special need kid, or to the special need kid at this time.
And our question here from Kathy Flaherty is, are they ever going to hold the meeting of the community committee that got canceled yesterday because of server problems? And for people who don't know, right, didn't the whole Capitol crashed yesterday?
Yeah.
Or a big piece of it.
Mark, what do you know about that?
They I don't know. They did. I thought they tried to reboot. It was a community roundtable, but I will confess, and I know Kathy, and she'll be charitable. But I can't. No, I can't recall. They've been trying to do a bunch of. They all call them all roundtables or community meetings, and so I'm not sure. But I will find out.
Try to find out. Yeah. Hey, Kathy.
Yeah. Any last words from you guys? I mean, Beth, we talked a little bit about how people are coping in quarantine. Like, I don't know, are you cooking anything good? Are you getting anything done? Anything fun?
So I don't know if I'm getting anything done other than work, but I am definitely cooking a lot. And I recently started making my own French bread, which has thrilled my husband. And I've been cooking these big, huge meals very late every night, usually involving a lot of heavy cream and white wine. And that's how I'm coping.
I think that's how a lot of people are coping. I love the homemade French bread, though. That's excellent. Paz, are you cooking at all?
I have regressed to my college years in some ways. My wife is away visiting one of our kids, and I probably should not confess to this, but there have been a couple nights this week that dinner did involve cereal and ice cream. Separate bowls.
I ate half a block of brie cheese with my fingers last night at 11 o'clock, waiting for somebody who shall remain nameless to file a story.
Yes,
so.
Yes.
So this is what happens. So this is a little inside scoop here. When the reporter keeps the editor a little too late and maybe blows a deadline, she starts eating brie cheese with her fingers. That's
exactly right.
This is how we'll end things, folks. Beth Hamilton and Mark Pazniokas, it's good to see you both, and hopefully we'll see you both in person again sometime soon.
Is anybody going to ask Kyle if wearing a hat during a pandemic signals a very bad haircut experience recently?
Is somebody going to ask me that question? I don't know that I want to answer that question. Is there any hair under the hat? That's going to be answered at the next Ask the Mirror webinar.
Okay. All right.
It's going to be a big reveal.
Right. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. This has been fantastic. The questions were great. I see some feedback about wanting to do this more often, and we hear you. Send me that email and CC my boss, publisher at ctmirror.org on that email, saying we should do this more often, and we'll get the Mirror and see if we can make that happen. This is great. We want to be accessible to you. You are our members. You are what makes this possible. You make the Mirror possible. So we want to be a resource to you and make sure that we're answering the questions that you have, not just throughout this crisis, but even in normal times too. So this has been great. Our next event is going to be on June 24th. It's going to be our coffee conversation. We'll have Jacqueline Rabe Thomas and Education Commissioner Miguel Cardona, along with a few other folks, talking about the impact of this crisis on education for K-12 kids. So thanks again for being here tonight, folks. Have a great night, and let's stay in touch.